has been very silent while all this has been going. In fact, the only thing I've seen the Chief Justice speak about was on the issue of abductions, and I think later on, when her chambers were raided, she issued a statement or something to that effect. But listening into what we are being told and the conversation going around, part of the broken system is our judicial system, Mr. Speaker. People know, Mr. Speaker, that even if you're taken to court, you can find your way around it, Mr. Speaker, that you can buy justice. A country that sells its justice, Mr. Speaker, is not a country. If I know that all it takes for me to get away with murder, Mr. Speaker, is sufficient resources in my bank account, then that is not a country. Judicial Service Commission, Mr. Speaker, just like us and all of us that are in positions of responsibility, Mr. Speaker, must engage and be willing to guide us and say this is what has happened. If you listen, as people who are speaking, people have shared their experiences, how they have been disinherited of properties that were left by their parents because a rich person showed up, Mr. Speaker, and as orphaned children, they could not put up a fight before our courts of law. That is not the foundation of a judicial system, Mr. Speaker. And we need time to reflect. JSC must tell us, what is it that we need to do, Mr. Speaker? Equal opportunities has featured prominently. Many people are saying, we know that all it will take for you to get an employment anywhere is to have people of influence. We have constitutionally mandated institutions, Mr. Speaker, NCIC and so many others. Let's see the studies that they have done so far out of the millions that we have sent to them over the years. Are they just collecting per diems and traveling to Naivasha? Or they have done a scientific study that can help us to appreciate. You know, the problem in this country, Mr. Speaker, is that people love proposing half solutions. And that's what we are being told, that that is not enough. It is not just enough to tell us that this community has this percentage of jobs, this one's has the other. Can you make recommendations? And we are willing to come and pass a resolution of the House, Mr. Speaker. If it is established, Mr. Speaker, that the community that I come from has more than an equal share of opportunities, Mr. Speaker, in the various cadres and levels of government, Mr. Speaker. Let's pass a resolution here and say that until such a time that others get an opportunity equitably, Mr. Speaker, we don't give chance to those because, but unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, listening and reading the reports that have come from NCIC, it is so basic and it's like the person who designed it just wanted to appease people with little facts here and there, Mr. Speaker. Oh, Kikuyus have this percentage, Luos have the other. That's not enough. Break it down. Work like a serious institution. Tell us how many CEOs exist in public service. Give us their distribution. How many senior level managers exist? How many are ordinary clerks, Mr. Speaker? We could be talking about a particular community that has a certain share, Mr. Speaker, but they are all clerks and drivers. It's not the same. We need a more detailed study so that you lead us as a house into making this conversation. I'm trying to rush, Mr. Speaker, because I know time is not on our side. Governance on our value systems, Mr. Speaker, featured prominently in this conversation. And we must put it either by law, by design. What is it that you do as a public official when certain things are said about you? How is it, Mr. Speaker, that in certain countries, that you as a public officials, even when you're just accused of having an extramarital affair, forget about stealing public resources. The system is so advanced that you're challenged and are told, Mr. XYZ, if you cannot be faithful even to your partner, you cannot be faithful to your current, to the country, that your character has been found wanting. And people are asked to step aside on such occasions, and people do the honorable thing and say, I think I no longer enjoy the trust of the people. Allow me to pursue other things. On personal matters, I'm not talking about public issues, Mr. Speaker. The problem with us is even when we have been challenged on public issues, Mr. Speaker, we still want to stick and die until, you know, the famous quote that somebody once said, I'd rather die than resign. On debt, Mr. Speaker, I have a certain level of reprieve as a person, but it still doesn't help me. Like I said, these young people don't care, and the people that are speaking don't care, because on the 2 occasions that the debt question appeared before this House the last term, I voted against it, both to move it at 6 trillion and eventually when we moved it to 10 trillion, Mr. Speaker. But that doesn't help. That's history. We can point fingers and say you moved, you did this or the other. It doesn't matter at this point. The thing we are being told first, Mr. Speaker, is that when Kenyans look keenly, they are trying to locate 10 trillion in the country and they cannot see it. So they're asking, are you sure, first of all, that we owe 10 trillion? And I have made public confessions, Mr. Speaker. Those that served with us in the Budget and Finance Committee last time, Mr. Speaker, know that when we asked for Kenya's debt register, it was brought to us on an Excel sheet. No records beyond that. And you're being told, company this, you owe them this much, this is the rate at which you borrowed, and so on and so forth. It pointed out to a problem. In fact, on the day that I made my contribution and said that I reject this approval of the debt, raising of the debt ceiling to 10 trillion, that's part of the reasons that I raised that afternoon, Mr. Speaker. And I said, until Parliament has a counter copy of what the Treasury is borrowing, Mr. Speaker, and we rearrange that whole space of our debt, Mr. Speaker, we are not yet out of the woods. Therefore, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the issue of debt, Mr. Speaker, but we are being told that a public audit of our debt situation, Mr. Speaker, is mandatory at this particular point. And I know the executive will do theirs, but even us as Parliament, because it's us who failed in that regard, we must carry out our own, so that we counter-check with what the executive is doing. Parliamentary Budget Office can lead this exercise, but if they need the expertise of other audit firms, including international, reputable, established institutions that can help us in this conversation, people who know about multilateral lending, Mr. Speaker, and going to the financial markets, because there are issues of Eurobond therein and other institutions that we have borrowed from, Mr. Speaker, let us have that conversation so that we know, first of all, Mr. Speaker, what is our debt exposure. Look at even the debt ceiling change of law that we did earlier. Makes sense. We argued and said we want to change how we calculate our debt status, Mr. Speaker, as opposed to having it as a static number, make it as a percentage of the GDP, because that's a more globally accepted standard. And that's fine. And I supported that motion, Mr. Speaker. And we said in 3 years' time, we want to bring our debt sustainability to 55% of the GDP. It is now at 61. We have 3 years. But what is the plan, Mr. Speaker? What did we learn from the past? How comes when you were passing that particular legislation, we didn't tie it so neatly so that we know? You know, bringing debt as a percentage to the GDP to 55% is not an occurrence, Mr. Speaker. It's not an event. It's a process. You have to grow down your fiscal deficit over the years. We didn't put it in law, Mr. Speaker. And it's not just enough for us to be satisfied and say that we have a promise that in 3 years' time, that's where we'll be. At the time of exiting this conversation, Mr. Speaker, we must tighten that law so that even as those that do our budget at the Treasury know that the maximum fiscal deficit that we can get for this year, 2024, 2025, is this one. And you tighten it so that by you leave them with no option. So that by 2027, Mr. Speaker, when you're supposed to be at 55%, they have no option but to get there. But if we leave the law as it is, I can tell you for a fact that we will get to 2027, we will still be at 60, Mr. Speaker, or even more if we don't change. And we must make a decision, Mr. Speaker, as we sit and reflect, because debt has featured prominently in this conversation. As I move to conclude, Mr. Speaker, SRC, Salaries and Remuneration Commission, have been silent as this whole debate has been raging. Silence is not an option anymore, Mr. Speaker. They have to speak to the country. They have to tell us what is it that you're going to do so that we reduce our public expenditure on wages and salaries from 46% to the mandatory 35%, Mr. Speaker. If it means taking a pay cut We as members of parliament, Mr. Speaker, good people, we have been told that it's not possible, that members of parliament will never do it. We don't have an option. We must do it, Mr. Speaker. The yearly increment that is now being discussed, that we are being told that, I saw that being reported or misreported in sections of the media, that we are now going to earn more. SRC continues to be silent about it, but we must make a resolution and say we reject even that one in light of the financial situation. But as it is, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, even if the high earners were to take a shave on their salary, that is still not enough. I don't have the statistics, and that's why I've said some of these constitutional commissions have failed us, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what will be the percentage of Kenyans say that earn over and above 100 and 150. But I'm certain, Mr. Speaker, they are in the slim minority of less than 10%. 90% of our public officers earn less than 100,000 and below, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, whatever savings that we can make there, let us make. But over and above, the thing that people don't like, Mr. Speaker, and this featured prominently. Senator Omogeni is out, but he knows this featured prominently in our NADCO talks. And a report that we tabled here, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, which we haven't done with speed, Mr. Speaker, captured all the wastages that are in the public expenditure space and what we need to do as a country. From page 546 of the NADCO report, I think, to almost page 600, Mr. Speaker. Where things that we understand, things are tight. It's the most obvious thing that people do. Young people are telling us, when you have a job with Safaricom, you can live in Langata. But the day you lose that job, you move downwards to either to South B or Umoja until things get better. That's what we are not able to do as a leadership. We know for a fact that when things were better, we could all fly business as members of parliament. But if you read the recommendation from NADCO, we have said, any flight that is less than 3 to 4 hours, surely, must you fly business as a public official? 3 hours. You will not even sleep. You know? And so many things, Mr. Speaker, recurrent expenditure and wastages. Institutions, even parliament. And you know, I saw our staff criticize us and say, yes, we have been saying this or the other. But even our staffers, they need to know that this must come to them. You know, I've served as staff welfare chair, so I know a thing or two about expenditure in this institution. You will hardly get anybody in parliament, Mr. Speaker, on a Friday. Even to consider a report on something that happened in parliament, Mr. Speaker, people cannot consider it in parliament. It must be considered in Naivasha or Mombasa. As is the case in all our public institutions. We must lead by example, Mr. Speaker. And before we exit out of this motion today, we must give a blow-by-blow detail and say, what is it? What happens? Why is it that people cannot think in public offices on Fridays? That there must be somewhere in Naivasha, there must be somewhere in Kisumu, there must be elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, I don't think that there is any correlation between better consideration of a tender document or evaluation exercise that comes when you leave Nairobi, Mr. Speaker. These are extraordinary times, Mr. Speaker, and I must appreciate that there has been guidance, Mr. Speaker, and we are being reminded that because the finance bill has now been sent back via presidential memorandum and all clauses have been deleted. You know, that's a space that many people misunderstand. And sometimes we need to help people also appreciate parliamentary procedures. Number one, finance bill remains to be a bill. It's not an act of parliament, like many people have seen misreported in public spaces and says, oh, it takes effect on such and such a day. But as a sign of goodwill and trust, because trust has been completely eroded at this time, Mr. Speaker, I think the worst thing to do is for the National Assembly to come. The Budget and Finance Committee considers that recommendation immediately, Mr. Speaker, so that people are satisfied that that is behind us. But having done that, of more importance, the National Treasury must table the new budget estimates that captures, Mr. Speaker, the new reality. Less 3.9 trillion, less the 346 that was lost. And people must take a cut In fact, my proposal, Mr. Speaker, it's a very simple exercise. 346 out of 3.9 trillion budget, Mr. Speaker, is 9%. At least at the national level, because I wouldn't wish that the same be applied to our counties. For counties, it must be on equity basis, Mr. Speaker. But on government, national government institutions, just do a pro rata cut. If your budget was 300 billion, Mr. Speaker, as an state department or an agency, you submit your new estimates less than 9%, so that you are left to go and do the reappropriation of whatever needs to be done. And by next week, Mr. Speaker, we have a new budget that captures that particular reality, because, like we are being reminded, living within our means is not an option anymore. And I believe that when our colleagues reconvene in the National Assembly, they'll be guiding us in that particular. But I have to be specific and say, because in the first instance, the distribution to counties was not pro rata, then the shave, I don't know what is being proposed, and we will wish to be reasoned, but it cannot be pro rata to counties, Mr. Speaker. We must, at the very least, I know it's not in my place, but at the very least, Mr. Speaker, counties should not get less than what they got last year. At the very least, Mr. Speaker. I know it's difficult, but somehow, somewhere, we must protect. Though, members, I don't know if you follow this conversation, even in our own county level, people have become more critical in budget-making process. And they are beginning to ask our county governors, can you lay out your budget in public? So that we see also, where is your confidential vote, like there was. You know, there are many budget lines that people don't follow. But now people are becoming more alive to reality of the budget-making process in our counties. And we'll speak later. I'm sure when colleagues speak, they will get time. I cannot say everything. To say on also the architecture of devolution, whether as is presently moving, Mr. Speaker, whether it can work. You know, Mr. Speaker, you are governor. Between 2013 and 2017, many young people, women, and the vulnerable made a life out of doing business with counties. And there was spread of resources within. You know, in every village, you could see a young person and you'd be told so and so. He's a road contractor, he supplies this and the other. He trades with the county, and therefore, people could begin to appreciate. These are things that were completely unknown to the country before the promulgation of a new constitution. Post-2017, there are no such people in our villages, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I have said on the floor of this house many times that unless the governor is your personal friend, or sometimes even unless he's your father, nobody can dare supply to our counties anymore. Nobody can dare trade with them. As protectors and custodians of devolution, Mr. Speaker, the House charged with the responsibility to make sure that devolution works in our county. Before we exit this motion, we must propose a way forward. If it means forcing our governors to first clear all the pending bills that have been found to be eligible, Mr. Speaker, before rolling out any new development, so that you give life at least to the many women and young people, Mr. Speaker, that have lost whatever little savings that they had by trading with counties, Mr. Speaker. We must pass that particular resolution today, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of police, I just want to speak to two final issues, then I conclude. I once said in a public forum, I was asking,